Well, I am delighted to talk with you about the Future Security Scenarios Lab. This is a new initiative within the Future Security Program here at New America. And I'm so glad to have an opportunity to tell you about what it is and what we've been working on. Fundamentally, the lab grew out of the recognition that the security landscape is changing. And it's changing faster than the systems we've built to keep it secure. And that what we need is newer ways of thinking if we're going to keep pace. So a little bit about me. I came to this work by a slightly unconventional route. I started in philosophy, fascinated by how we know what we know. I moved on to neuroscience and complex systems, studying how people make decisions under uncertainty, and then eventually into political science to understand how states manage uncertainty at scale. And along the way, I worked at the State Department and National Defense University, where I got to see firsthand how strategy often depends less on information than on interpretation, on how institutions frame and understand the world around them. And that really is the crux of where we're at today. It's the crux of the problem today, and it was the impetus for the lab. Our existing security frameworks, so these are doctrines, tools, and assumptions we routinely rely on, they were fundamentally built for a different era. And by that I mean they presume slow change and stable actors and predictable escalation. But the environment we face today is unfortunately far less forgiving. Think of arms control unraveling, how deterrence is losing coherence, and how AI is transforming the tempo, the texture, and the psychology of strategic decision-making. And so the message became really clear that change itself was actually becoming the defining condition of uncertainty. And if that was the case, then we needed to do things differently. So that realization became the founding principle of the Future Security Scenarios Lab. That is to say, if the world is changing faster than our systems of governance, then we need to change how we think. And New America was actually the perfect place to do this with its long tradition of inventive policy-driven approaches, the future security program's emphasis on applied, forward-looking interdisciplinary research, and a community of thinkers that includes folks like Peter Singer, whose work in useful fiction has advanced future-oriented security thinking for years. The lab is designed to extend that lineage, to create a dedicated space for reimagining how we think about risk, foresight, and security in an age of accelerating change. So what do we do here? Well, the lab is designed as a space for rethinking security from first principles. That is, for challenging assumptions, testing frameworks, and building new mental models for decision-making under uncertainty. The lab's mission is threefold. First, we focus on AI and nuclear futures. This means, for example, understanding what comes next in our complex and rapidly changing nuclear security landscape, or for AI, working to achieve a better understanding of how the technology is transforming our decision-making and escalation dynamics, or even examining complex threat interactions, which is like studying how nuclear, cyber, climate, and biological risks amplify one another in an increasingly networked world. Second, we are a force multiplier within New America, serving as a hub that brings scenario thinking into the organization's broader work on democracy, technology, and global security, as well as a central institutional node for AI-related projects across New America. And third, we have aspirations for field building, convening like-minded, future-oriented disruptors in the security space. There are a lot of labs like ours popping up right now, and for good reason. The changing security environment demands a different tool set. I'm firmly convinced that a rising tide lifts all boats in this space, and that through greater coherence, we'll have more success and amplification. So how do we do this? Well, we use methods like scenario planning, decision theory, wargaming, and immersive exercises, as we discussed in the previous panel. And this is not to predict the future, but to expand the range of futures we can be prepared for. So our projects all reflect this approach. We are funding projects that, for example, examine why decades of nuclear risk warnings haven't fundamentally changed American behavior. And we're doing this using cognitive science and decision theory to understand how people filter and then normalize these kinds of warnings. For another project, we're exploring whether deterrence can even be restored as assumed in current nuclear doctrine and in a likely future security environment. And for this, we're using scenario planning and wargaming to test the limits of this assumption. We're also excited to be developing a simulation of an AI to AGI transition, exploring how that leap from artificial intelligence to artificial general intelligence or superintelligence could intensify global competition and what governance might look like in its aftermath. Within New America, we're embarking on a project to train policy experts as futurists, asking them to imagine futures of human flourishing, not just risk mitigation, in a world shaped by artificial intelligence. We're also exploring the use of predictive markets as an indicator of AI competition outcomes and laying groundwork for a salon on what comes after deterrence as an ordering principle in the international system. Each of these projects shares a common goal: to make future-oriented thinking an operational part of how we approach security and not an afterthought. So that is the broader architecture and mission of the lab: how we think about uncertainty, how we use foresight tools, and how we're trying to build a new field of anticipatory security governance. But to make this more concrete, let me turn to one of our pilot projects, our study of the new nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile, or SLCM. This is a proposed novel US Navy system that's designed to deliver a low-yield nuclear warhead from a submarine or at sea, giving the president a more flexible set of options below the level of an all-out or strategic nuclear war. On paper, it's about what some call filling a deterrence gap. And in practice, it also sits right at the heart of the most complex nuclear landscape we have ever faced, one that today is shaped by 3 major nuclear powers, the erosion of long-standing arms control treaties and norms, the rise of dual use and emerging technologies, all of this combined with mounting tensions in 2 theaters, the Indo-Pacific and European. So we chose SLCM as our pilot because it's an ideal test case for the lab's approach. It is a policy decision made under deep uncertainty where both sides of a very polarized debate rest on untested assumptions about the future in 2035 when the system will be deployable. So that led us to design a 3-phase process with each stage adding a distinct layer of insight. In phase 1, we interrogated fundamental assumptions of these belief systems. So to do this, we convened and interviewed senior experts. These included supporters and opponents of SLCM and those who are kind of in the middle. We wanted to map what they believed SLCM's utility was, and also the futures they imagined it useful for or harmful to. And we wanted to see where their assumptions converged and diverged. In phase 2, we identified key uncertainties. So to do this, we used a method called horizon scanning and combined this with scenario planning. And this allowed us to explore factors that were most likely to shape SLCM's future, again, 2035. And we settled on 2 variables in this exercise that mattered significantly and were still deeply uncertain. This was the pace of technology development and adoption, and the perception of the US arsenal as offensive versus defensive. And then finally, in phase 3, we asked experts to respond to a series of yes or no questions about possible future developments, and then to estimate the likelihood of each outcome. And this will allow us to see which futures are gaining traction and where expert opinion converges and diverges in these imagined futures. Each phase builds towards the same goal, and that is of transforming uncertainty from a strategic blind spot into a decision-making advantage. We want to make sure we aren't, as Peter Bergen said this morning, fighting the last war. Next, Mariam's going to talk us through the findings from these early phases.
Thank you, Amy. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. Good. So while we're still working on the analysis, but our interim findings are already quite informative. From our qualitative analysis of expert interviews, we found that positions on Slickerman are more than just divergent opinions. They are rooted in deeply held mental models about the world, deterrence theory, and the role of nuclear weapons in international security. We have identified two key mental models, as you see here on the slide. The first one is the less is safe perspective, and the second one is the more is secure perspective. Each one is associated with different risk preferences and is derived from different nuclear schools of thought. To start with the less is safe model, these are the experts who generally oppose Slickerman. Their underlying philosophy is often rooted in the idea of minimum deterrence, or a way of thinking that emphasizes a reduced reliance on nuclear weapons and favor restraint. These experts do not see a deterrence gap in current security architecture, and we define deterrence gap as a perceived shortfall or imbalance in a state's ability to deter its adversaries. In other words, they think that the United States has enough nuclear capabilities to remain secure, and adding new systems like the Slickerman offers little to no additional value. These experts are more risk-averse. They often refer to terms like misperception, miscalculation, and misinterpretation. They favor transparency over nuclear ambiguity and view Slickerman as a system that can potentially enhance this ambiguity by blurring the line between conventional and nuclear capabilities. The second model is the more secure model. These are the experts who generally support Slickerman. Their underlying philosophy is often rooted in the idea of tailored deterrence, or a way of thinking that emphasizes more reliance on nuclear weapons and an expanded US nuclear arsenal, both in size and variety. These experts believe that a bigger and more diverse nuclear arsenal means that the US can tailor these capabilities to specific security threats, and Slickerman is just one of such tools. Importantly, people in this mental model highlight that there is a current deterrence gap, and Slickerman helps to fill it. They are more risk tolerant. They often use terms like flexibility, credibility, resolve, survivability, and restoring deterrence. They frequently invoke the idea of an emboldened adversary, referring to an increasingly aggressive Russia and China that, in their view, warrant a more robust US deterrent posture. They advocate for maintaining nuclear ambiguity as a means of inducing caution on the part of the adversaries, which is an approach that stands in contrast to their counterparts' preference for transparency. This interim finding is consistent with the broader polarization trend we see currently in the US nuclear policy space. Even when it comes to a system like the Slickerman, which most experts actually agree is a relatively small piece of the bigger deterrence puzzle, expert opinion remains sharply divided. This suggests that meaningful progress may depend on finding common ground or bridging concepts between the two mental models. For example, we can agree to talk about fundamental concepts like strategic stability, even if we define it differently. It wasn't our goal to get experts to agree in this project, but we did find several areas of consensus. The first one is that despite polarized views, both Slickerman proponents and opponents agreed that the system is not a magic bullet for deterrence, meaning that Slickerman is unlikely to fully close the perceived gap in deterrence architecture, and nor would its deployment inherently destabilize the security environment. The second one is that both sides also emphasize the role of Slickerman in signaling commitment to allies, that is, sending a credible message that the United States is willing to employ nuclear options if necessary to come to their defense. The third one is that there's also a broad consensus that Slickerman would be more relevant and potentially more useful in the Indo-Pacific rather than the European theaters. And finally, both sides acknowledge that the credibility of US nuclear deterrent or policy depends on communication and perception more than it does on the nuclear arsenal size alone. And this is a particularly interesting finding or notable point, given that the number of Slickermans to be deployed currently remains classified. As I mentioned, we haven't finished processing all the data yet, but I'll walk you through where we are now and our methodology. So we started by analyzing qualitative interviews with experts and identified 19 key variables that capture how they think about concepts like deterrence, escalation, and the role of SLCM. To make these insights measurable, we created a code book, which as you can see on the slide. Essentially, what we did was we translated qualitative responses, so people's opinions and logic and reasoning, into numerical values so that we could analyze patterns across the data set. For example, if the variable was belief in deterrence gap, as you see on the first row here, we assigned a value of 1 to an expert who saw no gap and a value of 5 to someone who believed that there is a real gap to fill. And here's just 2 examples of what we got. On the left side, you see a scatter plot showing relationship between 2 key variables, the utility of SLCM and belief in deterrence gap. The question we were trying to answer was, do people who see SLCM as more important do so because they believe it fills a perceived gap in deterrence? Each dot here represents an expert view, although some dots have multiple expert data coded due to overlapping answers. The positive correlation and upward sloping line show a clear pattern. Experts who are more convinced that there is a deterrence gap also tend to think SLCM would be more useful in addressing it. In other words, views on SLCM aren't just technical disagreements about a single weapon system. They reflect deeper worldviews about how much deterrence is quote-unquote enough and whether new capabilities enhance or destabilize security. And that's exactly what makes this debate so polarized, that people aren't just disagreeing about a missile, but about how the world works more fundamentally. On the right side, you see a scatter plot showing a relationship between utility of SLCM and concern about entanglement risk. We define entanglement risk as the risk of mixing conventional and nuclear systems in ways that could cause misinterpretation and potentially even unintended escalation. The question we were trying to answer was, are the experts who see SLCM as more useful also less worried about entanglement risks? And the downward sloping line shows a clear negative correlation, meaning that the more an expert values SLCM, the less concerned they tend to be about entanglement. In other words, those who prioritize the deterrence benefits of the system often downplay its potential escalation risks, which is a potentially significant blind spot. And this finding, or this interim finding, gives us entry points for bridging the divides that we spoke about earlier. If someone believes there's a deterrence gap, they're likely to see a high utility in SLCM. But if we inquire further, asking questions like, what exactly is the deterrence gap? How is it defined? And how do we know it even exists? We can start to unpack and test those underlying assumptions about the system's value itself. Same way, if we start testing entanglement scenarios through wargaming or scenario planning, we might start to see changes in how experts think about the system, which is one of the many plausible future directions of this project and where it could go next. Thank you very much.
We're almost done, I promise. Okay, so in phase 2 of this project, great. So here we have a visual representation of one of the outputs of our phase 2 scenario planning session. Using horizon scanning, we identified those 2 variables I mentioned. So these were 2 high uncertainty, high consequence variables, the positive versus negative perceptions of the US nuclear posture, or viewed as defensive being positive, and offensive producing a negative perception. And then on the left side, unsustainable technological change. On the right side, sustainable technological change. These variables made up 4 potential worlds, and our experts were then each placed in one of these worlds. They were asked to build out the world, flesh out assumptions, identify risks and opportunities, and then identify indicators that the United States is moving into one version of the world or into their particular version of the world. What's interesting is that experts that were assigned a positive perception, defensive, of the US nuclear arsenal, regardless high or low pace of technological change, felt that their world represented the current state of the world, while experts with negative perceptions or offensive of the US nuclear arsenal, regardless high or low pace of technological change, felt that their world represented the likely future. And so this means there's a bigger consensus that today there are positive perceptions of the US nuclear posture, but that we are moving into a world where that will no longer be the case. Across all four worlds or scenarios, there was a consistent crux point that emerged, and this is China's reaction to US deployment of SLICMN. This means even though SLICMN moves the needle rather than changes the game in the nuclear landscape, consistent effort in the form of tailored diplomacy and clear nuclear signaling will need to be expended by the US to shape China's opinions of and reactions to SLICMN in order to avoid an in-kind or escalatory response. Ultimately, the Future Security Scenarios Lab is about rethinking how we think, not just about the next threat, but about the frameworks we use to understand security itself. Because in a world defined by accelerating change, the most important skill we can cultivate isn't prediction, it's imagination, the ability to see beyond the familiar and to prepare for the futures that are already taking shape around us. You can scan the QR code to learn more about our lab, and thank you very much.